The shocking story behind slavery's most famous photograph. Slavery was one of the worst things that has ever happened to humanity. People were tortured, mistreated, and killed like their lives didn't mean a thing. Here is the shocking story behind slavery's most famous photograph to give you a visual glimpse of what slaves went through. The story of Gordon. Gordon, also known as Whipped Peter, was a black slave in America who escaped from a Louisiana plantation in March 1863 after he was nearly whipped to death. The image of Gordon scarred back from whipping remains one of the most visually arresting depictions of slavery. The photograph opened the eyes of millions of people to the horrors of the slave trade in the southern United States. The photo was famously known as the scourged back. It became one of the most widely circulated photos of the abolitionist movement during the American Civil War and remains one of the most famous photos of that era. Since Gordon's photo was created over 150 years ago, it has been reprinted severally and has become a common fixture in museum displays, textbooks, university lectures, and documentaries. It remains one of the most photographic representations of slavery. Gordon was born in Louisiana on a plantation that belonged to John and Bridget Lyons. He was held captive alongside about 40 other people. One day, he was so severely beaten that he became bedridden for 2 months. After this horrific treatment, Gordon knew that it was time to escape from the plantation. Once he had a plan to escape, he began a very risky and painful journey to freedom. Gordon and 3 other slaves were chased by people recruited by his master to bring them back to the plantation. The men chased them with bloodhounds. Unfortunately, one of Gordon's comrades was killed by the slave hunters. They ran through creeks and fields barefoot. Gordon knew he would be pursued, so he took some onions which he rubbed on his body to throw the dogs off his scent. About 10 days later, Gordon arrived at a Union soldier stationed at Baton Rouge after traveling about 80 miles. By the time he arrived at the Union encampment, his clothes were in tatters and he was covered in mud and dirt. The black men in uniform welcomed him with open arms. He sought to join the Union lines because they were his chance at freedom. After his escape, he immediately took up refuge amongst the Union soldiers. Indeed, Gordon's 10 days of running through creeks and fields barefoot was nothing compared to what he had endured. Gordon had to go through a medical exam before he was allowed to enlist in a black regiment. The military doctors were horrified when they saw the extensive scars on his back. It was the visible result of a brutal flogging by his former employer. The injuries on his skin showed the level of brutality with which he had been beaten. At some point, Gordon revealed that the man who whipped him was Arteu Carrier, the plantation's overseer. Although the plantation owner had subsequently fired Arteu, it didn't dissuade Gordon from planning his escape. While he was in bed for weeks during recovery, he became more determined to leave. The doctors asked Gordon to pose for a picture so that they could reveal the inhumane treatment he had received. A photograph was then taken to capture the extensive keloid scarring on his back which he received during his years as a slave. The photo documenting Gordon's condition attracted so much attention, and once it reached public domain, it became one of the most circulated photos of the abolitionist movement during the American Civil War. It automatically became a powerful proof of slavery's brutality. A witness revealed that once Peter pulled down the dirty rags that covered his back, it sent a thrill of horror to every white person present, but the few blacks who were waiting paid but little attention to the spectacle, such terrible scenes being painfully familiar to them all. 2 photographers at the scene of the medical examination, McPherson and Oliver, were the ones that took pictures of Gordon's back. The photos were reproduced in large quantities and copies of Gordon's portrait were distributed as carte de visite, a trendy photographic format at that time. The pictures were quite cheap and became popular during the Civil War. Gordon's photograph rose to become one of the widely circulated images of slavery and showed how important the media was in letting people know how evil slavery was. In July 1863, these images appeared in an article about Gordon published in Harper's Weekly, the most widely read journal during the Civil War. The pictures of Gordon's scourged back provided people with visual evidence of brutal treatment of enslaved people and inspired many free blacks to enlist in the Union Army. There are no further records of what happened to Gordon. It's unclear what he did during the rest of the war or what his life was like after the Civil War. However, his image portrayed the deep brutality that came with slavery and what African Americans had to endure during that time. Thank you for watching. Take care.